Have you ever witnessed a moment so humiliating, so brutally public, that the world seemed to stop for a second just to absorb the shock? Because that's exactly what people are saying happened when the Australian Prime Minister shut down Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's desperate plea to come for a royal tour in Australia. Not delayed, not postponed, not under review. Shut down. Flat. Final. Unmistakable. And the most stinging part? It wasn't whispered behind palace walls or tucked into a diplomatic envelope. It was delivered in a way that made sure the entire world heard it. Loud, clear, and impossible for the Sussexes to ignore. But here's the real question. Why now? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why would Australia? A nation that once lined streets to cheer a young Prince Harry, that embraced Meghan on their first major tour, that showered them with headlines, flowers, speeches, applause, suddenly slammed the door so hard it echoed across the Commonwealth? And if you think this was just a scheduling conflict or a harmless political formality, think again. The timing, the language, the tone, everything about this refusal suggests something deeper, something calculated, something coordinated, something the public was never supposed to notice, yet couldn't look away from once it happened. So what really triggered it? Was it Meghan and Harry's fading popularity? Was it pressure from Buckingham Palace? Was it quiet fury from the Australian public? Was it politics? Reputation damage? Consequences finally catching up? Or was it something even bigger? A statement to the world that the Sussexes are no longer viewed as relevant, influential, or welcome representatives of anything resembling royalty. And here's where things get even more uncomfortable. This wasn't just a rejection. It was a message that seemed to say, you don't speak for the crown, you don't represent the monarchy, and you don't get to use Australia to reboot your image. If you've ever wondered how far their public standing has fallen, if you've ever asked yourself whether global leaders still take Meghan and Harry seriously, if you've ever sensed a shift but couldn't put your finger on it, this moment is the answer. But before we go deeper, let's step back and ask something the media avoids. Why were Meghan and Harry trying to come to Australia in the first place? Because that alone tells a story. Their brand is struggling. Their influence is shrinking. Their deals are collapsing. Their public image is wobbling. And their relevance, once red hot, is slipping faster than anyone expected. So what does a couple in freefall do? They look for a stage big enough to rewrite the narrative. Australia was that stage. And that's precisely why the rejection was so devastating. Imagine preparing a comeback. Imagine planning redemption. Imagine expecting doors to fly open, only to find them bolted shut from the inside. Now picture the world watching. Some people say this moment marks a turning point. Others believe it signals the beginning of the end of the Sussex era. And many are quietly wondering, if Australia said no, who's next? But here's where things get even more intriguing, because this wasn't just a simple decline and move on situation. Oh no, the way the Prime Minister handled it, the tone, the phrasing, the barely disguised political smirk, suggests there was more behind the decision than simple logistics. Some insiders claim the wording was intentionally cold. Some say it was coordinated with Commonwealth partners. Some whisper that Buckingham Palace was informed before Meghan and Harry were. Some believe it was meant to send a global signal. And if that's true, then this isn't just a snub. It's a warning shot. But before we unravel that part of the story, before we expose who knew, who didn't, who pretended not to, and who quietly celebrated, we have to talk about the feeling in the air leading up to this moment. Because whether you love Meghan and Harry or you're exhausted by their headlines, you can't deny one thing. Something has changed. The public tone, the media temperature, the political distance, the international body language. It's all different now. Even fans feel it. Even critics feel it. Even the indifferent feel it. So what exactly shifted? Was it the Netflix dramas? Was it the interviews attacking the monarchy? Was it the book? Was it the family rifts? Was it the inconsistencies? Was it fatigue? Was it overexposure? Was it that the world finally moved on? Let's be honest, comebacks require goodwill. But goodwill runs out. And when it does, the fallout is icy. And that's the atmosphere into which Meghan and Harry attempted to step. A world no longer applauding by default. A world that now pauses before reacting. A world that is recalibrating how it sees them, where they belong, and whether they still hold cultural weight. Which brings us back to the moment Australia said no. Because that refusal wasn't isolated. It was symbolic. A symbol of shrinking influence. A symbol of political caution. A symbol of public sentiment. A symbol of global recalculation. And the most chilling part? It wasn't framed as tragic. It wasn't framed as dramatic. It wasn't even framed as surprising. It was framed as obvious. Expected. Normal. Routine. As if the world had already shifted while Meghan and Harry hadn't noticed yet. And that's when the story takes a darker turn. Because while the rejection played out publicly, the reaction behind closed doors was reportedly filled with shock, disbelief, and frantic attempts to save face. Insiders claim Meghan was furious. Others say Harry was stunned. Some say advisors scrambled. Some say the Sussex camp tried to reframe the narrative. But you can't reframe a door that has already slammed shut. And just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get more uncomfortable, it did. Because someone leaked details that were never meant to surface. Someone wanted the world to know. Someone wanted embarrassment, not silence. Someone wanted this moment remembered. And once those details leaked, commentators began asking a question that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Are Meghan and Harry no longer welcome in the Commonwealth? Think about that. The Commonwealth. The very institution that once lifted Harry onto balcony railings, wrapped Meghan in adoration, and presented them as the fresh, modern face of royalty. Now, doors are closing. So if Australia has taken this position, if other nations are watching, if political leaders are coordinating, if Buckingham Palace is quietly observing, where does that leave the Sussexes? Because rejection isn't just about being denied access. Sometimes it's about being denied importance. And that's what makes this story matter now, not because of gossip, but because of what it reveals about power, perception, and the slow fade of cultural currency. But just when you think the humiliation reached its peak, just when you assume the damage is complete, just when you imagine the story has settled, something else happens. Something unexpected. Something sharper. Something with consequences. And that's where the story turns next. Because what the Australian Prime Minister said afterward didn't just reject Meghan and Harry. It exposed something far bigger and far more damaging than anyone anticipated. Because after the refusal made headlines, after the wording was analyzed, after the shock rippled through social media feeds, the Prime Minister added a comment that no one expected. A comment that didn't just close the door. It locked it, sealed it, and welded it shut with a grin that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. And here's where the story starts to sting. He didn't treat them like royals. He didn't treat them like dignitaries. He didn't treat them like national guests. He treated them like influencers trying to book a promotional appearance. And the world noticed. Some laughed. Some winced. Some celebrated. Some cringed on their behalf. But everyone reacted. Because deep down, whether people admit it or not, there's a fascination in watching the mighty fall. There's a strange magnetism in seeing those who once commanded the world's attention now struggle to regain it. And that's the emotional undercurrent that made this moment explode the way it did. It tapped into something primal, something human, something we don't say out loud. Schadenfreude, the shock, the embarrassment, the unraveling of status. But here's the twist. This wasn't always the trajectory for Meghan and Harry. Once upon a time, they were unstoppable. They were adored, applauded, elevated, romanticized. They were the modern fairy tale. They were the fresh air the monarchy needed. They were the global celebrities with royal authority. And Australia was the place that proved it. Do you remember? Crowds so dense security struggled to contain them. Headlines calling Meghan the new Diana. Harry glowing with purpose. Australian families crying with excitement. Television specials capturing every step. Koalas, beach walks, speeches, the baby announcement. It was their peak. And maybe that's why returning mattered so much. Because returning wasn't just a trip. It was a reset button, a relaunch, a rebranding opportunity, a nostalgia extraction, a PR defibrillator. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Comebacks only work if the audience wants them. And Australia, for reasons still unfolding, didn't. So the question becomes, what changed? Was it the Oprah interview? Was it the accusations against the royal family? Was it the Netflix dramatizations? Was it the alleged contradictions in their stories? Was it the constant victim narrative? Was it the polarization fatigue? Was it the sense that everything they touch becomes a headline storm? Or was it something quieter? A gradual realization that maybe the world didn't need them anymore? That's the part that makes this story more than a political headline. It's psychological. And that's why the refusal hit harder than anyone expected, because it symbolized something the Sussexes have carefully avoided confronting. Without the monarchy, are they still relevant? And if the answer is becoming no, then Australia just confirmed it. Think about how narratively perfect and painfully poetic that is. The place where they once shined brightest became the place that dimmed the lights. So now the stakes skyrocket. Because if Meghan and Harry can't book a royal tour, if they can't secure political legitimacy, if Commonwealth nations won't host them, if leaders publicly distance themselves, what comes next? Do they pivot harder into Hollywood? Do they attempt activism? Do they seek sympathy? Do they attack the decision publicly? Do they pretend they never requested it? Do they leak an alternate version of events? Do they blame the palace, the press, the Prime Minister, Australian sentiment? Because make no mistake, someone will be blamed. That's the Sussex media pattern. Conflict, narrative repositioning, emotional reframing, victimhood repackaged, public empathy fishing. But this time, the world seems less eager to play along. And that's what gives the story its tension. It's no longer just about what Meghan and Harry do. It's about how much the world still cares. And the answer is shifting. Not loudly, not explosively, but subtly, steadily, icy and quiet, the worst kind of decline. But here's the twist you weren't expecting. The Australian Prime Minister didn't just shut down the tour. He hinted at why, and buried inside that hint, if you listen closely, is a clue about what other world leaders are thinking but haven't yet said aloud. A clue that suggests the Sussexes are entering a new phase, not one of fame, influence, and glossy magazine covers, but one of doors closing politely while cameras flash anyway. And that's why this matters. Not because it's scandalous, not because it's petty, not because it's political theater, but because it marks a moment in history where the global perception of Meghan and Harry shifted from fascination to fatigue and now to avoidance. And yet, there's one more layer. A layer no one expected. Because behind this refusal lies a private exchange. A private warning. A private implication. A private suggestion that Meghan and Harry are now seen as a diplomatic risk. Let that sink in. A risk, not an asset, not an advantage, not a prestige symbol. A risk. So the true question becomes, what did the Australian government see, fear, or want to avoid? Was it controversy? Was it unpredictability? Was it political backlash? Was it public hostility? Was it pressure from the monarchy? Was it economic non-benefit? Was it polling data? Or was it something darker? Something involving intelligence briefings and international coordination? Because insiders whisper that this wasn't just a tourism decision. It was strategic. And if that's true, then the story is much bigger than Meghan and Harry ever realized. But here's the moment where everything tightens. Because just as the Sussexes were trying to recalibrate and recover from the blow, just as they were attempting to regroup and reinterpret what happened, just as they were preparing to quietly move forward, a second shock hit them. One even more humiliating. One even more public. One even more symbolic. And that, right there, is where the real story begins. It all started with a question that no one expected Meghan Markle and Prince Harry to be asking again. Could they return to Australia for a royal tour? Not a private visit, not a charity stopover. A royal tour, the very thing they publicly walked away from when they stepped down from their roles in the monarchy. And yet, behind closed doors, away from cameras and speeches and carefully curated statements, that request was made. Quietly, strategically, hopefully. But why? Why Australia? Why now? And what does it reveal about the place the Sussexes find themselves in today? Because this wasn't just about geography. This was about symbolism. A return to Australia would have been more than a trip. It would have been a reset, a revival, a restoration of something Meghan and Harry have been struggling to reclaim: global relevance. Do you remember the images from their last tour? Crowds roaring, hands reaching, banners waving, newspapers exploding with headlines about Meghan's charm and Harry's renewed purpose. A pregnancy announcement that electrified the world. That tour was their golden era. Before Oprah, before Netflix drama, before family fractures became international theater, before critics sharpened their tone, before polls dipped, before the mystique faded. Returning to Australia would have allowed them to reconnect with the version of themselves the public once adored, the hopeful, glowing, destiny-shaping couple that seemed to embody the future. And that is exactly why they reached out. But here's where the story twists. Because the request didn't come from a place of power. It didn't come from a place of confidence. It didn't come from royal entitlement. It came from something else entirely. A need. A need for visibility. A need for validation. A need for a platform large enough to shift public opinion. A need for the world to remember who they used to be. The Sussexes, according to insiders, believed a return to Australia would recast them as global figures instead of US-based celebrities struggling to maintain momentum. Their advisors saw opportunity. Their strategists saw narrative. Their communications team saw resurrection. But here's the uncomfortable question. Did the Australian government see any of that? Or did they see something completely different? Behind the scenes, the request reportedly landed on the desks of senior officials in Canberra, and the reaction was not what Meghan and Harry expected. Instead of excitement, there was caution. Instead of discussion, there was hesitation. Instead of rolling out the red carpet, there was a pause so heavy it echoed. Why? Because times have changed. Australia remembers the bushfires. Australia remembers the monarchy tensions. Australia remembers the interviews. Australia remembers the headlines. Australia remembers the shifting allegiance between Harry, Meghan, and the Crown. And public sentiment, once enthusiastic, is now divided. Some Australians still admire the couple. Some feel indifferent. Some feel frustrated. Some feel exhausted. Some feel betrayed by the attacks on the royal family. Some feel the Sussexes are using the Commonwealth when convenient. And governments don't like division. They like safety, predictability, harmony, political benefit. Hosting the Sussexes used to be a win. Now, not so much. But Meghan and Harry didn't seem to anticipate that. In their minds, Australia was still the land of cheering crowds and glowing coverage. A place where charisma could overshadow controversy. A place where baby bumps and speeches about empowerment could erase the headlines that have piled up since. And here's the part that stings. They thought Australia needed them. But the world has shifted in ways they didn't see, or refused to see. Because while the Sussexes have been building brands, podcasts, documentaries, memoirs, and media narratives, the Commonwealth has been quietly redefining its relationship with the monarchy. And Australia, more than most nations, has been openly discussing Republican sentiment, discussions that intensified after Queen Elizabeth's passing. So imagine the contrast. A country debating the future of monarchy, while the couple who left the monarchy asks to return as royal figures. Politically risky, publicly awkward, symbolically conflicting. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. The Sussexes didn't just want a tour. They wanted the treatment that comes with one. Security, ceremonies, receptions, motorcades, diplomatic hosting, national positioning. And that is where the Australian government allegedly drew the line. Because if Australia agreed, what message would it send? That Harry and Meghan still represent the crown? That the monarchy endorses them? That their royal status remains intact? That stepping down had no consequences? Prime Minister Albanese, whether you agree with him or not, is a strategist. He reads optics. He calculates narrative. He anticipates implication. And hosting Meghan and Harry would have carried implications no government wants to mishandle. So while Meghan and Harry saw opportunity, Australia saw complication. But the Sussexes didn't give up after the first signal of hesitation. Sources suggest they tried to emphasize their charitable goals. They highlighted causes. They referenced past goodwill. They framed it as a mutually beneficial engagement. Still, Canberra did not budge. Because here's the deeper truth, one the Sussexes may not have anticipated. Influence is not something you declare. It's something others grant you. And the moment a government declines to participate in your narrative, the narrative shifts. So what did the Australian Prime Minister do? He didn't ignore them. He didn't delay the request. He didn't bury it in bureaucracy. He shut it down. Directly. Decisively. Publicly enough that journalists picked it up. Cold enough that commentators raised eyebrows. Measured enough that it couldn't be called rude. Clear enough that it couldn't be misinterpreted. This wasn't uncertainty. It was dismissal. And here's the emotional core of Chapter 1. Harry and Meghan weren't just rejected. They were reduced. Not by tabloids. Not by critics. Not by the royal family. but by a head of government. That's why this chapter matters, because it marks the moment when the Sussexes' requests no longer came with automatic prestige. And yet, there's another layer to this. Because according to whispers surrounding the decision, the Australian government didn't just reject the tour because of political complications. They rejected it because of timing. Why? Because the timing wasn't random. It aligned with declining public support polls, recent controversies resurfacing, Buckingham Palace repositioning itself, international press fatigue, questions about legitimacy, concerns about media circus fallout. And that means the refusal wasn't passive. It was intentional. So now the question becomes, did the Sussexes misunderstand their global standing? Did their advisors miscalculate? Did they assume the world still revolved around their narrative? Or did they believe Australia owed them something? These questions form the tension that carries us forward, because the rejection wasn't the end of the humiliation. It was only the beginning. Because what happened next would reveal just how dramatically their influence has shifted and how deeply this refusal cut behind the scenes. And the shocking part? The next development didn't come from Meghan. It didn't come from Harry. It didn't come from the palace. It didn't come from a journalist leak. It came from inside the Australian government itself. And once those details surfaced, everything changed. Because according to those familiar with the internal discussions, someone in Canberra, someone with access, someone with awareness, someone close enough to the conversation to feel the political temperature, decided that the public deserved to know that Meghan and Harry had asked to come and were turned down. That leak didn't happen by accident. Leaks like that never do. They happen because someone benefits. Someone wants to send a message. Someone wants to steer the narrative. So who benefited? Not Meghan and Harry, that's for sure. Not Buckingham Palace, they stayed silent. Not the monarchy, they avoid messy headlines. Not the Australian public, they weren't demanding updates. The only beneficiary was the government. Why? Because by leaking the rejection, the government signaled strength. A stance independent of royal influence, immune to celebrity pressure, and aligned with the national mood. And that tells us something crucial. The decision was political capital, which means the Sussexes weren't just declined. They were used to demonstrate sovereignty, used to reinforce national confidence, used to show that Australia, not royalty, decides who represents it. And therein lies the twist. Meghan and Harry thought a tour would elevate them. Instead, the refusal elevated the Prime Minister. That's the power dynamic shift at the heart of this chapter. The moment when the Sussexes stopped being global power players and became political props. And that brings us to the emotional undertow. Because if you strip away the palace intrigue, the media spectacle, the Commonwealth symbolism, and the glossy narratives, you're left with something simple. Rejection hurts, especially when you don't see it coming. Especially when you expect applause. Especially when you believe the world still needs you. Especially when you built an identity around being wanted. And according to sources close to the Sussex circle, the rejection stung more because they genuinely believed Australia would welcome them back. They believed the public affection of 2018 still existed. They believed their humanitarian branding would override political tension. They believed their global narrative still resonated. But this rejection shattered that belief. And once belief shatters, doubt floods in. Did they overestimate their appeal? Did they misread public sentiment? Did they assume too much? Did they wait too long to return? Did they burn too many bridges? Did they think popularity was permanent? These are the internal questions their team reportedly scrambled to contain. But here's the part that shifts the emotional tone, because the rejection didn't just trigger doubt. It triggered fear. Fear that other nations would follow. Fear that influence was slipping faster than expected. Fear that Hollywood alone could not sustain relevance. Fear that the monarchy might outpace them in public sympathy. Fear that time was no longer on their side. And when fear mixes with pride, the reaction becomes unpredictable. Some insiders claim Meghan wanted to counter the narrative. Others say Harry urged a softer approach. Some say advisors debated going public. Some say silence was chosen reluctantly. Some argue they considered portraying themselves as the ones who declined. But here's the key point. When you are truly powerful, you do not need to respond. Their silence revealed the truth. And the Australian government knew it. Because what happened next, after the leak, after the headlines, after the commentary, was even more telling. The Prime Minister didn't retreat. He didn't soften. He didn't clarify. He didn't soothe. He reaffirmed the refusal. And in politics, reaffirmation is the final blow. It said, this was intentional. This was considered. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not negotiable. And suddenly the story was no longer about a rejected tour. It was about a shift in global hierarchy. Harry and Meghan had attempted to operate as royalty, but were treated as private citizens. And here is where the audience must pause and reflect. What happens when a couple who walked away from the monarchy discovers the world has accepted their exit more fully than they have? Because that is the question sitting underneath every headline. It's the question that defines the new reality the Sussexes must navigate. Not, how loud can they speak? But, who is still listening? Not, where do they want to go? But, who will still host them? Not, what narrative do they tell? But, who still believes it? And that's why Chapter 1 matters, because it sets the stage for everything that follows. It shows the moment when intention collided with reality, when desire collided with diplomacy, when memory collided with momentum. And it leaves us with a final, unsettling realization. If Australia, the country where they once shined brightest, now keeps them at arm's length, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Because if power is measured by access, and access is denied, what remains? Yet, as significant as this refusal was, it was only the first domino. Because while Meghan and Harry were still recovering from the shock, still recalibrating their strategy, still searching for a way to regain footing, another development emerged. One even more revealing. One even more damaging. One that would expose just how far their influence has declined beyond the borders of Australia. And that next development? It didn't come from a critic. It didn't come from a journalist. It didn't come from the palace. It came from another Commonwealth nation watching closely and preparing to make its own move. Why is Australia such dangerous territory for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry? Why does the mere mention of a return tour send political advisors, royal analysts, Commonwealth commentators, and even former palace staff into a quiet, uneasy shuffle? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't comfortable, because Australia is not just a location in their story. It is the place where everything that now haunts them began. The adoration, the scrutiny, the comparisons, the symbolism, the doubts, the cracks. Australia is the mirror they don't want to look into, because it reflects the version of them that once seemed unstoppable and the version of them now struggling to stay relevant. But let's rewind, because to understand the magnitude of the Prime Minister's rejection, you have to understand the power of the first visit. Back then, Meghan was the dazzling new Duchess. Harry was the redeemed lost prince. The crowds were massive. The media was euphoric. The monarchy was glowing. The fairy tale was alive. Australia embraced them like no other nation, and the world noticed. Photos of Meghan cradling her stomach went viral. Commentators declared her the new global icon of the royal family. Tabloids called them the future. Politicians praised them. Teenagers idolized them. Newspapers sold record issues. Tourism spikes were recorded. Television audiences soared. Australia wasn't just a tour stop. It was a coronation of public opinion. And that is precisely why a return now would have been powerful, because returning to the place where the myth began could have revived it. It could have reignited nostalgia, softened criticism, erased tension, and rewritten the current chapter of their public lives. But here's the twist. Australia was also where the first fractures appeared. Not publicly. Not loudly. Not immediately. But those who were close enough saw it. Staff tensions. Protocol stress. Internal disagreements. Shifting press tone. Whispers about behavior. Rumors that never quite faded. Some say Australia was the first time Meghan realized she could outshine the monarchy. Some say it was the first time Harry sensed the press turning. Some say it was the first time palace aides saw trouble ahead. Some say it was the first time William and Catherine grew uneasy. And here's the chilling irony. The place that lifted them up is the same place that foreshadowed their downfall. That duality is why a return was tempting and risky. Because Australia remembers everything. Australians remember the glow, but they also remember the controversy. Australians remember the excitement, but they also remember the shifting attitudes. Australians remember the charm, but they also remember the storm clouds forming. And no politician wants to reopen a national memory that might not play out the same way twice. But the deeper danger lies in something most people outside the Commonwealth don't fully understand. Australia is the symbolic testing ground for monarchy sentiment. When public opinion shifts in Australia, the rest of the Commonwealth watches. And right now, Australia is in an era of identity reassessment. Republican movements rising, royal roles questioned, generational attitudes shifting, loyalty becoming optional rather than inherited. So imagine the optics. A nation reconsidering the monarchy, welcoming the couple who criticized it. It would blur the message. It would confuse the narrative. It would stir political backlash. It would strengthen Republican arguments. It would weaken institutional ties. The government knows this. The palace knows this. And whether Meghan and Harry realized it or not, they were stepping into a symbolic minefield. But the danger doesn't stop there, because Australia is also the place where comparisons to Princess Diana reach their peak. Meghan's clothing, her gestures, her speeches, her emotional resonance with crowds. Commentators drew parallels. Headlines echoed history. Camera angles duplicated iconic moments. And that comparison terrified the monarchy, not because Diana was beloved, but because Diana became uncontrollable. Australia is where Diana became a phenomenon. Australia is where Meghan's narrative echoed it. And that parallel, once flattering, is now political dynamite. Because if Meghan returned and was adored again, what would that say? To the palace, to the press, to the public, to the heirs, to the institution. The monarchy cannot afford a second Diana narrative, especially one operating outside the family, independent, monetized, and media-armed. So Australia isn't just emotionally dangerous. It's historically dangerous. But here's the third layer, the psychological danger. Because returning to the scene of past glory forces a comparison between who you were and who you are now. And the Sussexes are not who they were then. Back then, they were untouchable symbols of unity. Now, they are polarizing figures of division. Back then, they represented monarchy renewal. Now, they represent monarchy rejection. Back then, they were adored for what they symbolized. Now, they are analyzed for what they criticize. Returning to Australia would have forced the world to confront the contrast, and contrasts are unforgiving. Which brings us to the fourth danger, public sentiment. Australians don't respond well to hypocrisy, and many now see Meghan and Harry as wanting the benefits of royalty without the responsibilities. Australians value authenticity. Australians dislike entitlement. Australians resist theatrics. Australians have sharp radar for performance. And in the years since the first tour, the Sussexes' image has shifted into something Australians are increasingly skeptical of. Curated vulnerability, profitable victimhood, emotional branding, narrative manipulation. So inviting them back would have been a gamble, and political leaders don't gamble unless they gain something. Meghan and Harry believed Australia still viewed them through 2018 eyes. But Australia has moved on. The world has moved on. And that realization, the realization that the adoration of yesterday cannot be summoned on demand, is what makes Australia such dangerous emotional territory for the Sussexes. Because acceptance can be rebuilt, relevance can be re-earned, public affection can be reignited. But nostalgia? Nostalgia only works if people miss you. And that is the haunting uncertainty at the heart of this chapter. Do Australians miss them? Or have they become a reminder of a story that ended badly? But the fifth and final danger is the most explosive one, because this isn't just about Meghan and Harry. It's about the monarchy. Australia's refusal wasn't just a rejection of the Sussexes. It was a subtle signal to Buckingham Palace. We recognize authority through the king, not through them. And if one Commonwealth nation signals that, others may follow. Which raises a chilling question. Did Australia just redefine the Sussexes' global status? Not royal, not diplomatic, not symbolic. Just celebrities. And if that's true, then everything changes. Because celebrities can be rejected publicly without consequence. Royals cannot. That is the true danger of Australia. It exposes the gap between what Meghan and Harry believe they are and what the world is beginning to see. And that brings us to the cliffhanger. Because as Australia quietly repositioned them, another Commonwealth nation was watching. And that nation was about to make a decision of its own. One that would deepen the humiliation, expand the consequences, and make it impossible for the Sussexes to pretend the first rejection was an anomaly. Because while Australia was analyzing the request, weighing the optics, forecasting the backlash, and taking the temperature of public opinion, another nation within the Commonwealth family was paying close attention, not to Meghan and Harry themselves, but to the reaction surrounding them. And that nation understood something vital. If Australia, the very stage that once crowned them as global darlings, no longer felt compelled to welcome them, then declining them elsewhere would no longer be seen as controversial. It would be seen as reasonable, expected, justified. And that is where the danger becomes exponential, because the Sussexes cannot afford a pattern. One rejection can be spun, 2 rejections become narrative, 3 rejections become reality. And once reality forms, perception hardens. And once perception hardens, influence evaporates. The Sussexes know this. Their advisors know this. And that is why Australia mattered so much, because it wasn't about tourism or charity or goodwill. It was about momentum. Momentum is the currency of public figures. And nothing kills momentum faster than losing the ability to command international welcome. So now the emotional question surfaces. Did Meghan and Harry realize they were gambling with their most valuable remaining asset? Because fame isn't the same as relevance. Attention isn't the same as respect. Coverage isn't the same as influence. Publicity isn't the same as invitation. Australia drew that line. And once one nation draws a line, others feel safer drawing theirs. But here's the part people overlook. The rejection didn't just show that Australia had moved on. It showed that the Sussexes misread their own legacy. Because Australia didn't reinterpret their 2018 tour. Australia recontextualized it. Back then, the tour was seen as magical. Now, it is seen as the beginning of the unraveling. Back then, Meghan's impact was viewed as transformative. Now, it is viewed as destabilizing. Back then, Harry was seen as stepping into his destiny. Now, he is seen as walking away from it. The symbols have reversed. And symbols matter, especially in nations where monarchy exists more as narrative than authority. Australia doesn't follow the royal family because it rules over them. Australia follows the royal family because of story. And Meghan and Harry broke their story, not by leaving, but by attacking. And now, Australia has responded not emotionally, but structurally. So what does that mean moving forward? It means the Sussexes can no longer rely on the nostalgia of their early years as working royals. It means they can no longer assume that past adoration guarantees future access. It means they cannot resurrect 2018 by merely stepping onto a tarmac. Because nostalgia only works when people want to remember. And this is the cutting truth. Australia remembers differently now. And that's why the Prime Minister's refusal struck so deeply. It wasn't just political strategy. It was historical repositioning. It said, the Australia of 2018 is gone. The perception of 2018 is gone. The version of Meghan and Harry that 2018 created is gone. But here comes the twist. If the Sussexes had never returned to Australia, the myth might have lived longer. Because sometimes the memory of a moment shines brighter than the moment itself. By trying to return, they forced the world to examine the contrast. And the contrast wasn't flattering. And that is why their request was more dangerous than anyone realized. But now we reach the most explosive part of this chapter, because Australia didn't just refuse privately. The story leaked. Headlines emerged. Talk shows dissected it. Radio hosts mocked it. Commentators framed it as a fall from grace. And whether fair or not, perception hardened. And perception, once hardened, becomes truth in the public imagination. So now we arrive at the cliffhanger that leads into Chapter 3. Because the leak didn't merely embarrass Meghan and Harry. It exposed the internal reaction inside the Australian government. Laughter, dismissiveness, relief. And someone close enough to witness it, decided the world needed to know. Which raises the question. Who leaked it? And why? And what did they stand to gain? Because leaks have motives. And this motive was not random. There's a moment in every political story where the curtain slips, where the polished statements and diplomatic phrases fall away, revealing what people really think behind closed doors. And in the case of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's rejected request to tour Australia, that moment came when the internal reaction inside Canberra started to leak. Not in official memos, not in controlled press releases, but in whispers, sideways comments, and private conversations that somehow found their way to journalists. That's when the world realized something shocking. The request wasn't treated seriously. It wasn't handled with reverence. It wasn't approached with protocol. It wasn't weighed with royal sensitivity. According to those familiar with the discussions, it was met with something far more humiliating: amusement. And that is where this chapter begins. Because the way the request was received inside the Australian government reveals more about the Sussexes' current global standing than the refusal itself ever could. Imagine the scene. A staffer brings the inquiry into a briefing room. It's placed on the table, not with urgency, but with a raised eyebrow. No one rushes. No one shifts posture. No one reacts with surprise. Instead, someone reportedly says, "Why would they think we'd host them?" Another allegedly adds, "Are they still doing royal tours?" A third, according to whispers, laughs. Do they even count as royals anymore? Now pause for a moment and feel the weight of that. Not long ago, the mere mention of Harry and Meghan would have electrified officials. Schedules would have been rearranged. Tourism departments would have mobilized. Public relations teams would have drafted messaging before lunch. Every politician would have wanted to be photographed shaking their hands. But now, the reaction was closer to disbelief that the request had even been made. And here's where it gets even more astonishing. Some staff reportedly assumed the request was a joke. Not satire. Not parody. A genuine misunderstanding. Because surely, they thought, Meghan and Harry must know they can't request a royal tour when they're no longer working royals. But they did. And that detail alone sent ripples through the political inner circle, because it suggested something almost unthinkable. The Sussexes may still see themselves as global representatives of the monarchy, but the Australian government does not. And that difference, that gulf in perception, is what transformed the internal reaction from confusion to commentary, from commentary to mockery, and from mockery to leakage. Because once people start laughing about something in politics, someone eventually tells a journalist. And that's exactly what happened. An insider, someone who heard the initial reaction, someone who watched the tone unfold, someone who sensed the political opportunity, shared the sentiment with select members of the press. Not word for word, not tied to a name, but enough to send a message to the world. The Sussexes are not taken seriously here. Now think about what that means. A government didn't just say no. A government didn't just decline politely. A government didn't just choose someone else. They refused with indifference. And indifference is the most painful rejection of all, because outrage means you matter. Debate means you're relevant. Controversy means you still have influence. But indifference? Indifference means the world keeps moving without you. And that is exactly what Meghan and Harry fear more than anything, becoming background noise. But the leak didn't stop with amusement. It deepened as more details emerged, painting a picture of internal discussions that bordered on dismissive. One report suggested a senior advisor commented, "We don't need that circus here." Another reportedly said, "It would distract from actual governance." And perhaps the sharpest whispered line of all, "Hosting them would make us look like we're starstruck, not sovereign." Let that sink in. The Sussexes weren't seen as a diplomatic asset. They weren't seen as cultural value. They weren't seen as beneficial to the nation. They were seen as a risk to credibility. That's the moment where the story shifts from personal humiliation to political repositioning. Because governments don't fear celebrities. They fear consequences. And the implication behind these internal comments was unmistakable. Hosting Meghan and Harry could undermine Australia's political standing. Why? Because it would appear to validate them as royal representatives. It would blur the country's relationship with the crown. It would alienate monarchists and Republicans simultaneously. It would turn governance into gossip. No prime minister wants that. And so the conversation didn't last long. According to insiders, the request was dismissed almost immediately. There was no deliberation committee. No diplomatic coordination. No extended protocol review. It was a political shrug. But here's the part that changes everything. Because normally, internal reactions like this stay hidden forever. Governments protect their image. They maintain professionalism. They avoid appearing petty. But this time, someone wanted the world to know. Someone wanted the humiliation to spread. Someone wanted the Sussexes to feel the sting. So the next question becomes, who leaked it and why? Was it a staffer amused by the irony? Was it a strategist trying to score political points? Was it someone frustrated with celebrity intrusion into governance? Was it a monarchist wanting to defend the crown? Was it a Republican wanting to weaken royal symbolism? Was it someone with ties to the palace? Was it someone with ties to the media? The possibilities are endless, and that's what makes the leak so powerful. It doesn't matter who released it. What matters is that it was released. Because leaks define narrative, and the narrative created by this one was unmistakable. Meghan and Harry are no longer seen as dignitaries. They are seen as outsiders seeking relevance. And the humiliation grew deeper when the story hit the press, because the headlines didn't soften the tone. They sharpened it. Radio hosts joked. Television anchors smirked. Commentators called it predictable. Social media amplified the mockery. But the real blow came when political analysts framed it as evidence of a larger trend, a decline in global respect, a diminishment of symbolic authority, a collapse in diplomatic value. That's when the story escaped entertainment news and entered geopolitical discussion. But it didn't end there. Because while the world was reacting to Australia's internal dismissal, another layer of the leak emerged, one even more damaging. According to reports, after the initial reaction, someone in the room added a remark that sent shockwaves through the narrative. If they want attention, they can book a talk show. That line, whether perfectly accurate or loosely interpreted, carried explosive weight, because it reframed Meghan and Harry not as ex-royals, but as media personalities, influencers, content creators, publicity seekers, entertainment figures. And once that frame attaches, it's nearly impossible to remove. That line spread faster than the refusal itself, because it captured a sentiment people had been tiptoeing around. Are Meghan and Harry still public figures of substance, or just celebrities with royal packaging? And here's the chilling part. The Australian government wasn't asking that question. They were answering it. Which brings us to the emotional core of this chapter. This wasn't just a diplomatic refusal. It was a status downgrade. Unofficial, unspoken, undeniable. And it came from a nation that once helped elevate them. But now we reach the turning point. Because as humiliating as the internal reaction was, the aftermath was even more revealing. The leak didn't just expose how Australia viewed them. It exposed who else knew about the rejection before the Sussexes did. According to sources close to Commonwealth coordination, the refusal was quietly communicated to another major player, not in the form of consultation, but in the form of notification. Which raises a far more shocking question. Why would another nation need to be informed? Diplomatic protocol? Strategic alignment? Symbolic unity? Shared concern? Coordinated messaging? Whatever the reason, it suggests something far more consequential. Australia's rejection was not an isolated event. It was a signal, and someone beyond Australia, was watching closely. Because what happened next would deepen the humiliation, escalate the implications, and push the Sussexes into a position they never imagined they would occupy. Because once word spread that another Commonwealth nation had been informed, speculation exploded behind the scenes. Diplomats began whispering. Journalists began probing. Commentators began theorizing. And a startling possibility surfaced. One that would strike at the heart of Meghan and Harry's greatest fear. What if the rejection was coordinated? Not formally, not publicly, not through documents or treaties, but through shared sentiment, shared hesitation, shared caution, shared re-evaluation of their role in the modern world. Because Commonwealth nations do not always move together, but they often watch each other before they do. And if Australia, the nation that once cheered the loudest, now backed away, then others might feel emboldened to reassess their stance. That's how influence erodes. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, quiet drift. And that's what makes this leak so significant. It didn't just expose mockery. It exposed momentum. But here is where the emotional dimension deepens. Because while the public laughed, and analysts dissected, and politicians smirked, there was one group that didn't find any of it amusing. The Sussex inner circle. According to those close to the couple, the leak triggered a wave of shock inside their camp. Not because of the refusal. They could spin that. Not because of the headlines. They've survived worse. Not because of the political implications. They've learned to navigate those. It was the tone. The tone revealed something they weren't prepared to face. They are no longer feared. Once, governments handled them delicately. Once, officials worried about backlash. Once, leaders sought their approval. Now, they're a punchline, and that realization reportedly sent Meghan into crisis management mode. Not publicly, but internally. Messaging drafts were explored, narrative strategies were debated, soft denial options were considered, sympathy angles were floated, reframing tactics were discussed, but none were executed. Why? Because responding would confirm the story. Silence was not chosen from strength. Silence was chosen from necessity. Harry, according to whispers, took it harder than Meghan. Not because of ego, not because of publicity, but because Australia was one of the last places where he felt unequivocally loved. Returning would have been a return to belonging. The refusal shattered that illusion. And the leak? The leak rubbed salt into it. But the emotional fallout is only part of the story, because the internal reaction inside Canberra didn't just belittle the Sussexes personally. It reframed them institutionally. It showed that governments no longer see them as representatives of the crown, carriers of royal symbolism, diplomatic figures with inherited authority. Instead, they are seen as potential controversy, political clutter, celebrity distraction, reputational risk. And that matters, because the Sussexes' entire post-royal strategy relies on borrowed royalty. Without that aura, their value in global arenas diminishes rapidly. So now we arrive at the key question of the chapter. Did Australia just redefine how governments worldwide will treat Meghan and Harry? Because if they did, even unintentionally, then the Sussexes face a new geopolitical reality. They can tour the podcast circuit. They can appear in documentaries. They can launch lifestyle brands. They can produce media content. They can give interviews. They can speak on panels. But royal-style treatment, diplomatic hosting, national receptions, official welcomes, those may now be gone. And if they are gone in Australia, they may be gone everywhere. But here comes the twist this chapter has been building toward, because the leak revealed something else, something more subtle, something far more damaging. According to sources, after the internal remarks about a circus and a talk show, someone added another line, a line that chilled even those in the room. Let the palace deal with them. That sentence carries a world of implication, because it suggests Australia sees them as the monarchy's problem, not Australia's, not the Commonwealth's, not the world's. And if governments now believe the Sussexes are the responsibility of Buckingham Palace, what happens if Buckingham Palace does not want them back? That is the existential threat hovering beneath the surface of this entire saga. The possibility that Meghan and Harry now exist in a diplomatic no-man's land. Too royal for Hollywood. Too Hollywood for royalty. Too controversial for governments. Too unpredictable for institutions. Too polarizing for public unity. Too diminished for international reverence. And that is the most dangerous position of all, because power depends on placement. If you do not have a defined space, you do not have influence. And that leads us to the final escalation of Chapter 3. Once the leak spread, once the tone was exposed, once the mockery became public, the Australian Prime Minister was asked directly about it. Reporters leaned in. Cameras tightened. Microphones angled forward. This was the moment where he could have softened the story. This was the moment where he could have restored dignity. This was the moment where he could have offered diplomacy. He didn't. Instead, he doubled down, politely, calmly, strategically, in a way that made it clear. The decision was final. The reasoning was intentional. The message was deliberate. And that is where the chapter ends, because the Prime Minister's public reinforcement of the rejection didn't just close a door. It opened a question. If Australia feels confident shutting them out publicly, there are moments in public life when a single document, a sentence, a phrase, even a carefully chosen adjective, can change the entire trajectory of a story. And in the case of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's rejected bid for an Australian royal tour, that moment arrived when the leaked internal memo surfaced. Not rumor, not speculation, an actual written communication. And according to those who saw it, the wording was far colder, sharper, and more revealing than anyone expected. This was not a memo expressing regret. This was not a memo offering alternative dates. This was not a memo suggesting future consideration. It was a memo that conveyed something unmistakable. Australia does not require the presence of the Sussexes. And that phrasing, that deliberate choice of language, sent shockwaves through those who understood diplomatic nuance. Because governments don't write bluntly unless they intend to. They don't dismiss unless they want the dismissal to be noticed. They don't sharpen tone unless they are signaling a shift, not just in policy, but in perception. So what exactly did the memo say? That's the haunting part. The full text hasn't been released. Only fragments. Fragments that slipped through the cracks like shards of glass, small, sharp, and dangerous. One fragment reportedly read, "There is no strategic value in proceeding." Another, "Public reception is unlikely to be favorable." And perhaps the most devastating line, recommendation, decline without postponement language. No postponement language. No perhaps later. No scheduling conflict. No regrettably unable. Just a clean, decisive termination. Which raises the question, who chose that tone? A senior advisor? A communications director? A political strategist? The Prime Minister himself? Whoever it was, they understood the symbolism, because declining Meghan and Harry with gentle phrasing would have preserved ambiguity. But declining them with finality? That sends a message to media, public, Commonwealth partners, Buckingham Palace, and the Sussexes themselves. And here's where the story sharpens, because according to those familiar with protocol, that memo didn't stay contained. It was forwarded. It was discussed. It was referenced verbally in a meeting that included higher-ranking officials. And in that meeting, the language was not softened. It was reinforced. Which begs another question. Was the memo crafted to be leaked? Because if a government wants to send a message without issuing a statement, they leak a document. And if they want the world to understand the message without taking ownership, they leak only pieces of it. That's exactly what happened here. But the true humiliation wasn't in the refusal itself. It was in what the memo implied. Because the memo didn't treat Meghan and Harry as global figures. It treated them as liabilities. And that's where the tone becomes brutal. Because for a couple who built their post-royal identity on influence, inspiration, and humanitarian importance, being categorized as a political inconvenience is more damaging than any tabloid headline ever could be. But it gets worse. Because someone analyzing the memo noticed something chilling. There was no reference to Meghan's heritage. No reference to Harry's military ties. No reference to mental health advocacy. No reference to charity partnerships. No reference to public goodwill. In other words, none of the things the Sussexes believed defined them were considered relevant. The government didn't weigh them as cultural assets. They weighed them as political risk factors. And risk factors get removed, not accommodated. But here's where the narrative turns again, because according to a secondary leak, after the memo circulated, a follow-up note was attached. A short one, a clarifying one. And in diplomatic language, clarifying notes often reveal the truth behind the truth. This one reportedly said, "This decision aligns with current Commonwealth positioning." Current Commonwealth positioning. What does that mean? It means Australia was not acting alone. Australia was not improvising. Australia was not rogue. Australia believed its decision matched the broader sentiment of other nations connected to the Crown, which raises a terrifying possibility for the Sussexes. What if the Commonwealth is quietly shutting its doors, one by one, without announcements, without confrontation, without drama? Just no, 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 until the Sussexes realize there are no invitations left. And here's the emotional tension the world can feel without needing it explained. Meghan and Harry built their narrative on the idea that they left the monarchy by choice. But what if the world now suspects the opposite? What if the world begins to believe they weren't escaping, they were being eased out, and Australia's memo suddenly feels like evidence? But there's another layer, a darker, more strategic one. Because the wording of the memo did something subtle. It separated the Sussexes from the monarchy. It did not refer to them as royal representatives, members of the royal family, authorities connected to the crown. It referred to them as the couple, the pair, the individuals. That linguistic shift matters. Because when language changes, titles dissolve. And once titles dissolve, so does power. But here comes the part of the chapter that raises the stakes even higher. Because after the memo fragments leaked, political analysts began to suggest that the tone reflected rising concerns about royal-adjacent activism. Royal-adjacent activism, a phrase that implies chaos, a phrase that implies agenda, a phrase that implies unpredictability. Governments avoid unpredictability.